The bill was already framed when I walked into my father's dining room on Father's Day. At the top, in bold black letters, it read, "The price of raising a disappointment, $347,000. Beneath it was a detailed list of expenses: school clothes, birthday gifts, groceries, doctor visits, even the cost of keeping a roof over my head. Every dollar he had spent on me since childhood had been carefully calculated and totaled. Like an unpaid debt, what made it worse wasn't the paper, it was the audience. 99 relatives sat around the room or watched through a family video call, projected onto the television. I could hear scattered laughter. Someone whistled. Another cousin muttered, "That's actually generous." My father stood at the head of the table, smiling as if he had delivered the performance of a lifetime. "Since my child never became what I hoped," he announced, tapping the frame, "I thought it was only fair to show everyone the return on my investment." The room erupted in awkward chuckles. I felt every eye land on me. The air smelled of grilled meat and expensive whiskey. Silverware clinked against plates. Somewhere outside, children were playing, completely unaware that a public execution was taking place without a single drop of blood. I didn't defend myself. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't even look angry. Instead, I stared at the bill for a few seconds, memorizing every line, every number, every insult disguised as accounting. Then I quietly pulled out my phone, and while everyone celebrated my humiliation, I took a photograph that would destroy everything my father thought he controlled. My name is Daniel, and for as long as I can remember, my father treated achievement like a currency. In his world, people only mattered if they could prove their value. Success earned praise. Failure earned silence. Unfortunately for me, I never fit the image he wanted. My older cousins became doctors, lawyers, and business owners. Family gatherings often felt like award ceremonies, where everyone else's accomplishments were celebrated while mine were politely ignored. Whenever someone asked what I did, my father would answer before I could, usually with a dismissive shrug that told them everything they needed to know. The truth was far less dramatic. I worked as a forensic accountant for a private firm. My job wasn't flashy. It didn't come with impressive titles or public recognition. Most people had no idea what I actually did. My father certainly didn't. To him, I sat behind a desk pushing papers while others built careers worth respecting. I stopped trying to correct him years ago. The more I explained myself, the less interested he seemed. Eventually, I learned that some people don't misunderstand you by accident. They do it because the version they created is more convenient. Over time, I became the family member everyone overlooked. I was forgotten in group photos, excluded from important discussions, and contacted only when someone needed a favor. I paid hospital bills for relatives who never thanked me. I helped cousins resolve financial problems they created themselves. Then I quietly stepped aside once the crisis passed. Nobody noticed, or maybe they noticed and simply expected it. That was the role I had been assigned, the dependable disappointment. The funny thing about being underestimated for years is that people stop wondering what you're capable of, and when they finally realize they've been wrong, it's usually far too late. The Father's Day incident didn't happen in isolation. It was simply the loudest example of something that had been happening for years. Looking back, the warning signs were always there. At family dinners, my father had a habit of introducing everyone by their accomplishments. He would proudly list promotions, degrees, and business ventures. When it came to me, there was always a brief pause. "This is Daniel," he would say before taking a sip of his drink. He's still figuring things out. The statement was technically untrue, but nobody challenged it. A few relatives would exchange sympathetic smiles. Others would quickly change the subject. I learned to recognize those moments, the lowered eyes, the uncomfortable silence, the subtle assumption that I needed encouragement, while everyone else deserved respect. Father never insulted me directly when others were watching. His approach was far more polished than that. He preferred comments that sounded harmless on the surface. "You've always been different. You never cared much about success. At least you're happy." The words arrived wrapped in concern, but the meaning underneath was impossible to miss. Even my achievements somehow became evidence against me. When I purchased my first home, relatives congratulated me. My father smiled and said, "The market was easier back then." When I paid off the mortgage years early, he joked that I probably lived too cheaply. When my company promoted me, he asked whether they were short-staffed. The room would laugh softly. So that was the easiest way to survive. What nobody noticed was how carefully I watched everything, every conversation, every expression, every calculated remark, disguised as humor. The older I got, the clearer the pattern became. My father wasn't trying to understand me. He needed me to remain the family's disappointment, because as long as that role belonged to me, nobody would look too closely at the things he worked hardest to keep hidden. As the laughter faded around the Father's Day table, I looked down at the photograph I had just taken of the framed bill. For the first time, I wasn't embarrassed, I was calm, because the bill itself wasn't what caught my attention. It was the signature at the bottom, my father's, the same signature I had spent years examining in financial records, contracts, and audit reports. A detail most people would never notice suddenly connected to something I had discovered months earlier during an unrelated investigation. At first, I told myself it was probably a coincidence. I wanted it to be. Despite everything, he was still my father. But that evening, after leaving the party, I opened my laptop and reviewed a collection of documents I had legally obtained through public records and prior consulting work. The more I looked, the less comfortable I became. Certain dates matched. Certain transactions aligned. Small inconsistencies that once seemed harmless now formed a pattern. Nothing dramatic, nothing worthy of a police raid. Just enough to reveal that the man who publicly measured everyone's worth by money had spent years hiding uncomfortable truths about his own finances. Sat alone in my office until nearly dawn. The city outside my window was silent. When the sun finally rose, I made a decision. I wasn't going to argue with him. Wasn't going to expose him out of anger. Was simply going to show the family something he had spent years making sure they never saw. And for the first time in my life, I stopped worrying about protecting his reputation more than my own. The advantage of being ignored is that people rarely pay attention to what you're doing. My father certainly didn't, while most of the family saw me as the quiet relative who worked behind a desk. My career had taught me something valuable. Facts are far more powerful than accusations. As a forensic accountant, I spent years tracing financial records, verifying transactions, and building evidence that could withstand scrutiny. Emotion had no place in that process. Assumptions were useless. Documentation was everything, so I approached my father the same way I would any professional investigation, carefully, patiently, legally. Over the next several days, I reviewed public filings, property records, business registrations, and archived financial documents. Every piece of information came from legitimate sources. I wasn't searching for revenge anymore. I was searching for the truth. The pattern became impossible to ignore. For years, my father had presented himself as the family's financial success story while quietly concealing debts, failed investments, and misleading claims about where certain family contributions had gone. Nothing I found was fabricated, nothing required exaggeration. The facts were enough. I organized everything into a simple digital file, dates, documents, supporting records, clear explanations that anyone could understand. Then I attached a single photograph, the Father's Day bill, the document he had proudly shared with 99 relatives. When I finished, I didn't send it immediately. I waited, because timing matters, and sometimes the most effective response isn't the loudest one. It's the one that arrives when nobody sees it coming. 3 days later, I sent a single message, not to my father, to the same family group where he had proudly shared the bill. There were no insults, no threats, no emotional speech, just a short note. Since we're publicly discussing financial accountability, I thought everyone deserved complete information. Beneath it was a link to the file. Then I put my phone face down on my desk and went back to work. For nearly an hour, nothing happened. Then the notifications began. 1, 5, 20, 50. Questions appeared first. Then confusion. Then silence. Several relatives who had laughed at the Father's Day dinner were suddenly asking for explanations. Others were comparing documents and realizing the records matched. A few family members quietly discovered that money they had contributed over the years had never gone where they had been told. My father entered the chat shortly afterward. For the first time in my life, he had no speech prepared. No clever joke. No audience under his control. Just facts. Cold, organized, and impossible to dismiss. I never responded to his messages. I didn't need to. The family handled that part themselves. By sunrise the next morning, the group chat had become almost unrecognizable. Relatives who once defended him were demanding answers. Others simply removed him from private conversations altogether. The most remarkable part wasn't watching people turn against him. It was watching them finally see him clearly. The same way I had been seeing him for years. The weeks that followed were surprisingly quiet. No dramatic confrontations. No screaming phone calls. Just consequences unfolding at their own pace. Several relatives contacted me privately, not to apologize for the Father's Day incident, but to admit they had never questioned the story they had been given about me. For years, they had accepted my father's version because it was easier than forming their own opinions. Others were less comfortable. They realized they had laughed when they should have spoken up. That realization seemed to bother them more than anything I could have said. My father's reputation didn't collapse overnight, but the certainty surrounding it did. People began asking questions they had avoided for years. Family conversations changed. Assumptions changed. Most importantly, my place within the family changed. For the first time, people spoke to me instead of about me. They listened. Not because I had exposed someone, because I had refused to let someone else define my worth. That distinction mattered. The real damage wasn't the framed bill or the public humiliation. It was the message underneath it, that a person's value could be measured by someone else's expectations. Many people spend years carrying labels they never chose. The disappointment, the failure, the black sheep. Sometimes those labels become so familiar that we stop challenging them. That's why this story matters. Because sooner or later, everyone faces a moment when they must decide whether to live inside someone else's judgment, or step outside it and discover who they really are. A month later, the noise had faded. The group chats moved on to other topics. Family gatherings resumed. Life continued the way it always does after people run out of things to argue about. My father and I barely spoke. At first, that silence felt strange. Then it felt peaceful. For years, I had spent enormous amounts of energy trying to earn approval that was never truly available to me. Every achievement became another test. Every success became another moving target. The Father's Day bill taught me something I should have learned much earlier. Some people don't want proof that you're worthy. They want proof that they were right about you all along. Once I understood that, I stopped participating in the game. I focused on my work, my friends, and the people who valued me without requiring me to defend my existence. The future became surprisingly simple after that. As for my grandmother, the one person who didn't block my father, immediately she visited him the following week. Nobody knows exactly what she said, but afterward she called me and spoke only one sentence. A parent's job is to raise a child, not keep score. It was the closest thing to justice I ever needed. I never collected an apology. I never asked for one, because real revenge wasn't exposing my father. It was finally realizing that my worth had never depended on his opinion. The bill he handed me was supposed to calculate the cost of my life. Instead, it revealed the price of his judgment. And in the end, that debt belonged entirely to him.